Before I start this video, which is going to analyse The Emigree by Carol Rumens, I have been promising for several weeks now to give a shout out to some of my wonderfully annoying Year 7 students. So this is a quick hello to the Isabel twins, Lily, Debdeepta and Flo. That is done. Now please stop pestering me. On to the poem then. The Emigree by Carol Rumens. Looking at the title first, The Emigree. Emigrants are people who have left the country of their birth to settle elsewhere in the world. It's a feminine form of the word which suggests that the speaker of the poem is a woman, and that fits in with the fact that it's written by Carol Rumens. It is a poem that is, at least in part, about ideas of identity and belonging. And I think that the poem begs the following questions of us. And for each of these questions, I've put a couple of poems that you might choose as comparisons to the Emigree if you were to write about identity and belonging. So how far is our identity defined by where we are from, our place of birth, our culture? Checking out my history and kamikaze would be useful comparisons there. How far is our identity defined by the place in which we live? And I think London would offer you a nice comparison there. How important is the way those places look and feel to our identity? London again would be a useful comparison. And how does our identity change as we transition from childhood into adulthood? And checking out my history and kamikaze are very useful comparisons there. Before I teach this poem, I always show my students a collection of images, some of which are here. Images of war-ravaged, war-torn countries where places have been literally destroyed. And I always ask them to consider, how would you feel if this was your place? If this was your place of birth, if this was the place where you lived, if this was the place you called home, if this was a place that in some way defines who you are, if this was a place that has somehow shaped the person that you are, how does this affect your perceptions not only of the place in which you live, but the person that you are? And then I show them these three very powerful images, and what they do is depict three places in Syria before and after the conflict that is still ongoing in Syria. A place of beauty, a place of majesty, a place of culture, a place of peace, but one that has now become war-torn, war-ravaged and destroyed. How would that affect your feelings of identity? And that brings us on to stanza 1, and we'll go through this stanza by stanza and then look at some particular quotations from the poem. We'll read the stanza. There once was a country, I left it as a child, but my memory of it is sunlight clear, for it seems I never saw it in that November which, I am told, comes to the mildest city. The worst news I receive of it cannot break my original view, the bright, filled paperweight. It may be at war, it may be sick with tyrants, but I am branded by an impression of sunlight. We'll start with the opening line, there once was a country, which I think is reminiscent of Once Upon a Time. It reminds us of a fairy tale in some way. And I think that's an appropriate way to start, because the speaker in this poem has returned to a country which now seems like fiction. The place that she knew as a child is fictional, like a fairy tale, like a myth, compared to the one that she is confronted by now. And that line is followed by the ellipsis. And in that ellipsis, I think, is contained a feeling of regret and perhaps a feeling of longing to restore the country to what it once was. And I think in lots of ways, the very writing of this poem is an act of restoration. Through the narrator's memory, we get a restoration of the country as it once was. And that reveals the poet's power and the power of the poem to overcome the conflict. And we see that in lots of the poems in this anthology. the power of the poet to overcome hatred, to overcome repression, to overcome conflict. And we see that again here. Because the next line says, I left it as a child, but my memory of it is sunlight clear. So what the narrator reveals to us in the second stanza through that metaphor, sunlight clear, is that there is absolute clarity to the memory. Whatever they do to this place, whatever the tyrants that she talks about later do to her country, to her place of birth, they cannot take away her childhood memory of it. That is indestructible. For it seems I never saw it in that November, which I am told comes to the mildest city. The worst news I receive of it cannot break my original view, the bright filled paperweight. And again, a really powerful metaphor, because what paperweights do is they bring order to something which otherwise might be chaotic. And so what her memory is doing also is bringing order to what might otherwise be a chaotic identity. She remembers how it was, and that reminds her of who she is. So there's order out of chaos. Then we get a couple of modal verbs. It may be at war, it may be sick with tyrants. And I think the repetition of the modal verb here is significant, because what it does is create doubt in that idea that her country is at war and that it is sick with tyrants. The verb may contains possibility, but it also contains doubt. So the poet here is reclaiming the country as it once was. And then the stanza concludes with, I am branded by an impression of sunlight. And that verb choice is really, really important, because branding, as you can see from the picture of the horse there, is a method of marking an animal. It's done through heat and it's done through a process of scarring. So on the one hand, the verb suggests that the memory is a permanent one. It cannot be destroyed. It has become a part of her. The light that she attaches to that memory, the hope, the positivity, the peace that is attached to that memory is a part of her and cannot be removed. But the act of branding is also about scarring. And that suggests that the memory also carries with it a feeling not just of hope and possibility, but also of pain. On to stanza 2. The white streets of that city, the graceful slopes glow even clearer as time rolls its tanks, and the frontiers rise between us, close like waves. That child's vocabulary I carried here like a hollow doll opens and spills a grammar. Soon I shall have every coloured molecule of it. It may by now be a lie banned by the state, but I can't get it off my tongue. It tastes of sunlight. And in the opening lines there, we get the use of sibilants, the S sound, and assonance, the extended vowel sounds. And both of them, I think, create a feeling of something eternal, as if this memory, this city, will always be with her in her memory. It also creates a feeling of time, elongated time. And time is important here because, as in several of the poems, Rumens deals here with the destructive nature of time. We get the metaphor of the tanks for time. Time rolls its tanks. Time is destructive. Not only has it physically destroyed the place that she called home, but it is also doing its best to destroy her childhood innocence and her childhood memory. And this is where we start to draw that distinction between the innocence of childhood and the darkness of adulthood, because Rumens now talks about the frontiers rise between us. These are the barriers and the conflicts that we see as we go into adulthood. We don't get those barriers and conflicts as children. We don't see difference. We don't see friends and enemies necessarily. Those frontiers, those barriers come as we progress into adulthood. So this is about the destructive nature of time. The final line of the final sentence of this stanza, "It tastes of sunlight," is the use of synesthesia, using one sense to describe another, so using taste to describe sight. And it suggests actually that there is a sense of conflict in the narrator's memory, a sense of confusion in the narrator's memory, as if it can't quite be clarified as much as she would like. And then stanza 3 begins with the fascinating phrase, "I have no passport." Now, a passport is a sign of our identity, but it's also a sign of our freedom, our ability to travel. So at the start of stanza 3, there is a suggestion that conflict has caused the loss of the narrator's identity, but also the loss of the narrator's freedom, as if she is now stuck in this place, which is backed up by the following, "There's no way back at all." There's no way back to the place that she used to know. There's no way back to the city that she now remembers as a child. But still, through the act of writing this poem, she can reclaim some sense of the place that it was. "But my city comes to me in its own white plain." The white there, I think, has connotations of surrender, as if the city is giving up in some way. And it's also submissive to her. It is reliant now on the narrator, the poet, to reconstruct it, because it lies down in front of me, docile as paper. I comb its hair and love its shining eyes. She turns the city here, she zoomorphizes the city as a pet that is dependent on her. And in the writing of this poem, she is able to save it. That is why the city is now dependent upon her. But then it says, "My city," we get the personification of the city. She personifies the city in order to bring it back to life. This place of death, this place of destruction, this place of conflict, she brings it back to life within the poem. "My city takes me dancing through the city of walls." And in that verb dancing, there's a suggestion of celebration. That in the act of remembering and in the act of bringing this city back to life, there is a moment to be celebrated. Then we get, "They accuse me of absence, they circle me. They accuse me of being dark in their free city." And in those pronouns, they and me, we get a feeling of separation and a feeling of conflict. This is about adulthood again. The way as adults we seek to divide, we seek to recognize difference, we seek to repress people. And again, her city is dependent upon her. "My city hides behind me." And then we finish with the fascinating line, the third mention of sunlight in this poem. "My shadow falls as evidence of sunlight." We've gone from "I am branded by an impression of sunlight" to "it tastes of sunlight" to now "my shadow falls as evidence of sunlight." And this changing in the image of light, I think, is significant, because at the beginning of the poem, it is light that is associated with truth. It is light that is associated with hope. It is light that is associated with peace and innocence. By the end of the poem, the only evidence of sunlight is accompanied by shadow and darkness. So by the end of the poem, even where there is hope, it is tainted in some way by the darkness of conflict, by the darkness of adulthood. That pure sunlight of the beginning is gone, and it is replaced by something dirtier and something that is in conflict with itself. Just as her identity is in conflict with itself, because she has been forced to recognize that the place which once defined her will never be the same place again. We're now going to have a quick look at how you might structure a question. This is compare how the idea of identity is presented in Checking Out Me History and one other poem, and we're obviously going to choose the Emigree. For this question, ideally you need to plan 3 paragraphs with a clear comparison between the 2 poems, and I've written 3 potential example paragraph starters here, or paragraph ideas. Both poets initially explore how their identity was shaped by the events and memories of their childhood. Checking Out Me History is a positive recognition of identity. Ultimately, the Emigree is probably slightly more pessimistic. And paragraph 3, perhaps both poets explore the importance of heritage in shaping identity. When you've established your comparative ideas for each paragraph, you then need to identify the quotations. And here I've put quotations from both poems, which might be useful in writing up these paragraphs. Now you could take this away now and have a go at writing those paragraphs yourself using the ideas and using the evidence from both poems, but I'm going to show you an example of how you can go about that. It's an idea, I mean, I recommend this. You don't have to do it this way, and I don't want to disrupt anything that you've been taught. Sometimes it is better to keep the poems entirely separate, write about one and then the other. But I think in order to get the marks for comparison, it's better to open your paragraphs by comparing the 2 poems. So paragraph 1 might be, at the opening of both Checking Out Me History and the Emigree, the poets established the idea that our identity is shaped by the memories and events of our childhood. In the Emigree, the memory is seen as a positive reinforcement of one's identity, whereas in Checking Out Me History, the opening carries a pessimistic tone. I always encourage my students, when they're comparing, to find the similarity that exists, but then to find the difference, and that will allow you to develop your comparison. For example, in paragraph 3, both poets explore the importance of heritage in shaping one's identity. There's the similarity, but now we find the difference. Whereas in Checking Out Me History, Agard sees his cultural past as a means of finding himself, the narrator in the Emigree clearly sees the destruction of her home as having manipulated her sense of who she is. Similarity followed by difference, and you see you get a really detailed comparison by doing that. So what might paragraph 1 look like? Well, there's our opening, and then we've got to bring in our quotations and analyse them. This is Checking Out Me History now. Through the repetition of Dem Tell Me at the start of the poem, Agard emphasises the feeling that his childhood was one of repression. The repeated use of the imperative tell reinforces the notion that his education was forced upon him. Furthermore, we learn that this education has blinded him to his own identity and bandaged up his eye to his history, where his words in the semantic field of injury cements the feeling that this repression has caused Agard pain. You'll see once I've done the comparison at the start, I can then focus on one poem, bring in my evidence, and analyse the methods used by the poets using appropriate terminology. And that is your key to success in this question. Then I would say, however, in the Emigree, Rumens, present my difference and do exactly the same again. Bring in my evidence, analyse that evidence in detail. I hope that's been a useful look at Carol Rumens' The Emigree, and I hope that the work on the final few slides there is helpful in how you might go about structuring a response to the poetry comparison question.